Alright, seemed like you guys like my first chronicle of the Amazing Spider-Man series, so I suppose we should continue, huh? It's worth noting down the line as comics change, I'll do more issues per video, but for now, with the wordiness of Stan Lee's writing, and the fact that most issues are standalones and not longer arcs, we're gonna do just a handful at a time. Don't worry my friends, we got a lot left to cover. Anyhow, Spider-Man was a popular character from the start, and the following issues are a continuation of what we already covered, though as we'll eventually go over, working with Stan Lee in the hot Marvel bullpen of the 1960s would eventually break up Stan Lee and Steve Ditko as a writing duo. Regardless, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves, and we'll talk about that later in this video. Amazing Spider-Man 21 is another crossover with the Human Torch, a favorite pair of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's early run. Abner Jenkins, or the Beetle, is back on the loose with Peter deciding to make the Human Torch's girlfriend Doris fall in love with him since he's tired of Johnny's bullshit, and let's be frank, Spider-Man's kind of a dick in these early issues. She doesn't take the bait though, since Doris is tired of Johnny's own reliance on his superpowers, wishing he would just be normal sometimes. Hilarity ensues and the Beetle eventually grabs Dory as bait to get the Human Torch to fight him, but Spider-Man was around and the duo beat him down as you'd expect. Not much to say on this issue besides I like it. The Spider-Man Human Torch duo in the early days is so petty. I love seeing them just try to one-up each other on who can be the biggest asshole. People got to bear in mind high school Peter could be kind of an ass and isn't the all-around good-natured sweet guy he's often portrayed as today. I think that makes him more fun though. I like to think I'm a good person, but reflecting on my teenage years I could be a massive asshole, so I kind of like that Peter is too. The Beetle is kind of whatever and just the wraparound plot. The beef of the story is the back and forth between our heroes though. Amazing Spider-Man 22 sees the Ringmaster back in New York with Spider-Man reminding him that he and Daredevil beat him not too long ago in issue 16. His henchmen decide Ringmaster isn't working as their leader and in his place they elect the Clown. Peter and Betty head on a date to a display, and the Masters of Menace show up to loot the place, and Peter decides to use a spider tracer he placed on the Ringmaster to confront the villain. While taking him, he learns that the Ringmaster was ousted, and the Circus of Crime is now the Masters of Menace. Spider-Man, of course, finds the so-called Masters of Menace and confronts them, and start fighting when the Ringmaster shows up to reclaim his gang and their loot. Anyways, Spider-Man fights them and they all go to jail. Prince Python is new to this issue and is a member of the Circus of Crime since this time, appearing fairly frequently with the group ever since. As you may imagine, she is a woman with a python. Honestly, meh, it's okay, sort of filler. I like the Ringmaster getting kicked from his gang. It's kind of the goofy stuff we'd see in these early Marvel days, and the issue isn't bad, it's just not some knockout addition to Stan and Steve's run by any means. Amazing Spider-Man 23 finally features the Green Goblin in an issue I actually think is genuinely good, and not just worthwhile for its historical importance. It's also notable for being the first appearance of an African-American Spider-Man character, with some unnamed police officer filling in the role. Look, it's not huge, but I guess it's progress. It was the first step in a very long journey to getting our own Black Spider-Man down the line in Miles Morales, and was definitely a taboo that should never have been a thing, but since it was, I think it's fitting for Spider-Man to start smashing that glass ceiling a bit here. Green Goblin is back and attempting to take over Lucky Lobo's mob since he wants to start making big moves in New York crime. Meanwhile, J. Jonah Jameson hires on Frederick Foswell at the Daily Bugle. You may remember him as Big Man a few issues back in the run, and he's seemingly reformed. Meanwhile, Green Goblin's war on Lucky Lobo catches Spider-Man's attention, and the pair fight, though, after the prolonged battle at the end of the fight, the two both run out of their supplies, and Lucky Lobo's gang, who were fleeing the scene, get arrested, leaving Green Goblin back at square one. The comic is nothing major. It's more straightforward and less convoluted than the Green Goblin's past issues, and shows some criminal ambition, as well as not fleshing out the origin or anything like that, leaving it a mystery for another day. I think the Green Goblin is developing here and has yet to become the major tentpole villain he is today, but his lore is definitely starting to soup up as we conclude Ditko's run and start John Romita's run. which we will soon talk about. Amazing Spider-Man 24 sees Peter and Betty get a letter from Ned Leeds, his romantic rival for Betty. This while Peter starts tutoring Liz Allen, with that pair starting to grow closer to the dismay of Flash Thompson. This is as a psychologist, Dr. Ludwig Reinhardt tells J. Jonah Jameson that it's only a matter of time before Spider-Man's mind is broken and he goes crazy. Peter hopes to disprove this, but as he headed for the Bugle offices, he's attacked by his rogues gallery, though they quickly disappear, with Peter thinking that Dr. Reinhardt may actually be right and that he's starting to lose his mind. Confused, Peter chooses to go home to rest, hoping not to cause harm to people with these delusions. He ends up visiting Dr. Reinhardt, whose whole house is upside down, and Peter starts talking to the doctor. Informant for the Bugle, Frederick Foswell, meanwhile, tells Jameson that Reinhardt is a fraud, which pisses off Jameson into confronting the doctor, busting in moments before Spider-Man confides in the doctor who he truly is. Spider-Man finds out Dr. Reinhardt is that pesky Mysterio trying to find out his identity, and of course the day is saved. This is kind of a weird issue. Mysterio is fun, but due to the nature of the mystery plot, trippy imagery is minimal, and that's often the most fun thing about Mysterio issues. The romance building with Liz is interesting, but never leads to anything substantial, but the more human elements are fun. Overall, it's solid filler, but pretty much just that, filler. Amazing Spider-Man 25 is the issue that sees J. Jonah Jameson go from a nuisance to an actual threat to Spider-Man's well-being. This issue would eventually be remixed a bit in the alternate comic universe, Spider-Girl 10 and 11, which sees the titular Spider-Girl transferred back in time to assist her father during the events of this issue from the lens of the Earth 982 timeline. This is also the first issue that Steve Ditko got a plotting credit on. A strange character, Dr. Smythe, shows up with a robot that he hopes to sell to J. Jonah Jameson that he guarantees will lead to Spider-Man's demise. Peter thinks this is funny and goads Jameson into hearing the guy out, with Smythe activating his robot, which quickly captures Peter. Jameson tells him to stand down and agrees to use the robot to catch the real Spider-Man. This pisses off Betty, though, who didn't think Peter was a hater like that. Peter heads to school and Flash wants to fight him since Peter has started hanging out with Liz too much. That is when Jameson's new robot shows up, so Peter bails. Spider-Man starts fighting the robot to little success as Liz and Betty both head to Peter's house to check in on him, causing some tension between the girls, which only worsens when Mary Jane shows up in another unseen cameo, and they both realize they're cooked if this is their romantic rival. Peter ends up breaking the robot and goes home to chill, and that's when Aunt May finds his Spider-Man suit. Aunt May throws out the outfit, leaving Peter suitless, but Aunt May is off his trail for now. Spencer Smythe first appears here and is a mad scientist that's out for glory, defeating Spider-Man. He's kind of the ringmaster of the Spider Slayers. He eventually dies and was recently reincarnated, as is pretty standard with these Spider-Man villains. The Spider Slayer Mark I appeared here and is a robot that displays the user's face and can track Spider-Man's DNA. Of course, this is the first of a new line of Spider Slayer suits, and I'm mixed on the design of this one. Though it does allow for some fun situations, I suppose. There have been 21 Spider Slayer robots, and Smythe's son eventually becomes a Spider Slayer himself. We can talk about all that down the line, though. This issue is interesting, mostly because J. Jonah Jameson takes on a more active role in trying to knock off or expose Spider-Man. As I said, the Spider Slayer design is weird to me. I think I hate it, but I also think the concept leads to an interesting story, so I guess you could say I'm pretty mixed on it. The furthered human drama is good. I think Liz and Betty hyping up Mary Jane still a bit before we meet the character is fun and adds to her mystery. This is also a sticky love triangle that is forming and only gets more complicated with Ned Leeds in the picture. I'm here for Spider-Man as a soap opera, so I sort of love issues like this. Amazing Spider-Man 26 sees a new conspiracy with the Crime Master villain and the Green Goblin. This book would later be expanded in Untold Tales of Spider-Man 25, which sees the Green Goblin meeting the Crime Master. It's also worth noting Steve Gerber, creator of characters, most notably Howard the Duck, had a fan letter published in this issue. He would actually have several fan letters published throughout the history of Marvel Comics, along with people like George R.R. Martin, you can actually see some more modern creators in these letter columns, and that's always kind of fun. Peter is trying to figure out what to do about his lack of costume since Aunt May threw out his suit from the previous issue. Meanwhile, Green Goblin and the new villain, the Crime Master, are meeting on the docks. Both identities remain a secret, though. Both seem to know each other's identity, while we see Frederick Foswell down at the docks hiding clothes as a red herring for the issue. Peter at school tries assaulting Flash, but is caught by the principal. Flash owns up to being part of the problem too, which surprised Peter since Flash could have thrown him under the bus. That drama aside, Peter finally gets a Spider-Man suit off of a costume shop and decides to see what Frederick Foswell was up to, not trusting the ex-con fully yet. This is when he's assaulted by the Crime Master. Crime Master holds a meeting of the New York mobs, trying to stake his claim, but an informant, Patch, gives the information off and Spider-Man shows up, though is quickly attacked by the Green Goblin. Goblin tries to unmask Spider-Man, but since his mask was cheap costume store garbage, it was enforced by web fluid. The story ends up on a cliffhanger, with Spider-Man in Green Goblin's custody. The story picks up in issue 27, picking up where issue 26 left off. Everyone is really excited that they have Spider-Man at their mercy, though this is short-lived as Spider-Man wakes up and starts fighting the villains. Green Goblin and Crime Master escape in the confusion though, and Peter goes to J. Jonah Jameson with suspicion that Foswell could be the new Crime Master. This of course couldn't be possible, we find out as the Crime Master is across the street while Foswell is at J. Jonah Jameson's office. Anyhow, the Crime Master is blasted by a police officer, and with his dying breath, he tries revealing who Green Goblin is. He dies before he can though. Foswell turns out not to be the Crime Master, obviously, to everyone's relief, and Peter finally finds time to craft a new permanent Spider-Man suit to replace the one that Aunt May got rid of. And the still unrevealed Green Goblin vows his revenge. Crime Master, or Nicholas Lewis Sr., first appeared in this little arc, and was a short-lived one-off villain, though the legacy of Crime Master would be spread across numerous comics, with 4 other Crime Masters taking up the mess down the line. I think there's something classic about this almost pulp villain styling on this villain that leaves me unsurprised he became something that would occasionally resurface throughout Spider-Man's history, even if Nicholas Lewis Sr. himself wasn't incredibly important to the long-term lore of Spider-Man. This arc I think was an okay mystery, though the Crime Master's death was anything but climatic. I do think it adds the question on whether Foswell has truly left crime in the past, or is looking to eventually rejoin the mob. Green Goblin's secret identity is more at the forefront here, something that will start to pay off down the line. I think the build up to this mystery was a way to keep Green Goblin on the lips of readers and added to his long-term iconic arc, which led to him becoming an iconic villain, especially since writers and artists became fascinated with him down the line. Steve Ditko at points seems to be trying some new art techniques here. I kind of get a Carmen Infantino vibe from some of these panels. Overall, a pretty nice little two-parter. Amazing Spider-Man 28 is notable as the issue Peter graduates from high school. A lot of people may kind of forget based on how much the character is associated with his high school years, but Peter wasn't really in high school super long in terms of the main storyline, with Amazing Fantasy 15 coming out a mere 3 years before this issue dropped. Peter is visiting Smythe's laboratory, the guy who created the Spider Slayer a few issues back, and sees that he's in an argument with a guy, Mark Raxton, over some metal alloy. Anyway, Mark gets coated with the alloy somehow, and it gives him superpowers, which despite his name is pretty much just super strength, beating him in relatively short order. Following this, he makes it off to graduation. Following the ceremony, Liz Allen admits she had feelings for Parker, but following the comic, needs to be written out of the main cast to make room for his new college-era love interests that are about to emerge. Mark Raxton is the Molten Man, first appearing here, and in some sort of coincidental retcon is Liz Allen's half-brother. This series likes to be convoluted, as you can tell. Molten Man is definitely a B-villain, and as such isn't the most reused villain in the Spider-Man roster. Eventually he gets cured by his half-sister when she starts running the company Alchemex down the line. Molten Man appears 7 times in the flagship title since this issue, and only a few times elsewhere, making him a very, very slightly noteworthy character. I think what's most notable about this is Peter's graduation from high school. In hindsight, it seems a bit preemptive, but media has covered the concept of high school Peter now hundreds of times. Hell, the new Spider-Man MCU trilogy takes place entirely in high school. I think it's the most interesting era of Spider-Man, at least at the base level, since the Spider-Man high school balance is interesting. Amazing Spider-Man Annual 2 features Doctor Strange and Spider-Man's first big crossover. This is notable since both heroes are famously Steve Ditko's big Marvel contributions. It also sees reprinted stories from Amazing Spider-Man 1, Amazing Spider-Man 2, and Amazing Spider-Man 5. These issues were all covered by me in my first part, so I don't know why you're watching this if you missed that part, but check it out. It's a slow night for Spider-Man, as far too many superhero stories start. That is, until a strange villain, Zondu, starts hitting the town. Zondu hypnotizes some villains to rob Doctor Strange of a MacGuffin, and they manage to get said MacGuffin, but Spider-Man passes by wondering what's going on. A bunch of henchmen attack Spider-Man, but he gets a tracer on them, following them back to Zondu, who is headed to a different dimension as Peter follows. They're fighting when Doctor Strange pulls up and they beat Zondu, with Strange wiping the villain's mind. Nothing like a good old lobotomy, I guess, to end a comic book issue. Along with the first crossover of these two Ditko heroes, a crossover that would eventually make its way to screens in Spider-Man No Way Home, I may add, we also had the first appearance of Zondu, who's a small Doctor Strange villain who appeared only a handful of times. He's just another evil sorcerer guy, nothing too special. I think the idea of this comic is cooler than the comic itself. Doctor Strange and Spider-Man are so different and are two characters that you wouldn't expect to mingle if it wasn't for Steve Ditko, but something about the duo also kind of works. I think the plot was weak, not a great villain plot nor a great plot in general, and honestly I would have liked a bit more crossing over between Doctor Strange and Spider-Man themselves, frankly. Amazing Spider-Man 29 sees the return of Scorpion, who just broke out of prison seeking revenge on Spider-Man as Ned and Betty come back from Europe. Scorpion arrives at the Bugle office to try to get vengeance on J. Jonah Jameson, but of course Spider-Man pops up to fight him, taking the fight from the bullpen to the rooftops before Scorpion's inevitable defeat. Peter heads back to the Bugle, and Betty is headed out, having PTSD from Spider-Man's involvement with her brother's death, while Aunt May has a dizzy spell that is foreshadowing her diminishing health we see over the next several issues. This issue's kind of breezy, and it's the one that kind of recontextualizes Spider-Man following his graduation and distance from Betty beginning to form, along with Aunt May's health problems, which become more prevalent in these early college issues. The Scorpion action is really fun. Overall, nothing too notable, but it's decent. Amazing Spider-Man 30 continues the Amazing Spider-Man book's quest to put some legs under a post-high school Peter Parker. Following both Aunt May and Betty's health scares, Peter is prowling the city looking for crime and stuff, Spider-Man stuff, and as he's going around, he passes right by a cat burglar who robs J. Jonah Jameson's apartment, who puts a reward out for the crook's capture. Jameson offers $1,000 and Spider-Man shows up to tell him that he intends on collecting said reward. Meanwhile, Peter bumps into Liz, who got a new job with Flash Thompson, trying to figure out the job. Though Peter is more concerned about Betty, who he meets up with, learning that Ned proposed to her, though she's unsure yet if she intends to accept, with her torn between Ned and Peter. Anyhow, Peter heads out to clear his head and finally meets up with the cat burglar, who gets the jump on Peter, but ends up being captured by the cops. Peter feels a little more annoyed by the outcome of this, and when he next heads to the Bugle, he kind of blows off Betty. The only first appearance in this book is the cat burglar, a literal unnamed villain, who I wouldn't even mention if it wasn't for his brief stint as the Prowler, with him stealing Hobie Brown's suit and becoming the Prowler for 2 issues in Spectacular Spider-Man. For some reason, he never got named in any of his appearances. I don't know why. He isn't particularly notable by any means, though. The cat burglar stuff is not very interesting if I'm being honest, but the comic furthering Peter and Betty's drama with her being proposed to by Ned and Peter not knowing if he wants to go for Betty or if he even loves her anymore is interesting and a bit of a personal conflict for Peter, which we see going forward a bit for this run. Amazing Spider-Man 31 is one of the last really important Steve Ditko era comics from the series, introducing both Gwen Stacy and Harry Osborn, both of whom would go on to be major characters as the series transpires. Spider-Man is swinging around town and he sees a group of thugs doing a daring heist to steal some tech. Spider-Man chases them, but they appear to go underwater, which leads him to a base where they talk to their leader, Master Planner. Later, Peter signs up for his first year of college as Aunt May starts becoming seriously ill. Peter is accepted to college on a science scholarship, and his new classmates find him to be an asshole since he blows them all off, too depressed about Aunt May's seemingly sudden illness. Peter heads off to the Daily Bugle, but news is slow, though there's a tip that nuclear weapons parts are being transferred, which Peter checks out, as the thugs from the start of the issue try to steal these parts as well. Spider-Man stops the theft, though the Master Planner is still planning some shit. Meanwhile, Aunt May's condition looks bad, and she seemingly doesn't have much longer to live. 3 big first appearances happen in this issue. Gwen Stacy, who becomes the second major love interest for Peter and is most famously killed off by Green Goblin down the line. Her alternate universe self becoming Spider-Woman on her world. Carnage in the Ultimate Universe, and more. But even the main Gwen had numerous fake-out returns and a possible real return that is being solicited in the comics right now. Peter will eventually choose her over Mary Jane for a while before Peter and MJ become a thing down the line following her death. Anyhow, Gwen slowly eclipses and pushes Betty out of her place in the cast, but we'll get there eventually. Harry Osborn is another crazy-ass character, so he becomes Peter's best friend and really his first close friend in the comics. Occasionally he's a rival as well, but sticks up for him against Flash, who doesn't let graduation stop him from bullying Parker. Regardless, eventually he becomes Green Goblin in place of his father, becomes a drug addict, and then eventually dies in Spectacular Spider-Man 200, though in 2007 he has his own clone who effectively serves as a reincarnation, who then becomes a superhero, American Son, sort of an answer to his father's Iron Patriot identity. This clone eventually dies, though the real Harry Osborn was in hell the whole time, until Doctor Strange frees his soul so he can go up to heaven or whatever. Yeah, so that's Spider-Man comics for you. Anyways, finally you have Miles Warren, who was Peter's professor. Oh, you think he just stayed his professor? Hell no, this is Spider-Man. He becomes the Jackal in Amazing Spider-Man 129, then he makes a bunch of clones of everybody, including Gwen Stacy, himself, and several Spider-Man clones, most famously Ben Reilly or Scarlet Spider, and Kane, who, he also becomes Scarlet Spider. This issue is kind of the official start to Peter's college career, more interesting as the first appearance of Harry, Gwen, and Miles, all of whom would go on to have a massive impact on Spider-Man's wider lore. It's human drama heavy and more set up for the next few issues, more action heavy approach on this one. On top of that, Aunt May's illness is also pretty cool setup for what's to come. Amazing Spider-Man 32 and 33 continues the Master Planner arc that was sprinkled in amongst the human drama of the last few issues, with the issue revealing said secret villain is actually Dr. Octopus, who is doing some nuclear experiments. Peter's life outside of Spider-Man is also not going so well. Still unsure of how to handle Betty, he decides to be a total dick to her, so she'll hate him the way she hates Spider-Man. He does just that, but Ned Leeds tells him he needs to chill before Peter runs off to visit Aunt May in the hospital. Aunt May is dying due to radioactivity in her blood, due to a blood transfusion Peter did with her in Amazing Spider-Man 6. Determined to save her life, he heads off to Kurt Connors, or the Lizard, who he figures can probably do something. He says he may be able to save her life with a substance known as ISO 36, which Peter saves up to buy, though the stuff is stolen in transit. Spider-Man tracks the substance, but it turns out Doc Ock was the one trying to take it, who destroys a beam that traps Spider-Man. He of course escapes and makes it to Kurt Connors, who formulates the ISO 36, which they administer to Aunt May while Peter awaits the results. He shows up to the Bugle all banged up, and Betty's like, "What the hell happened to you?" Ultimately fearing Peter is too dangerous for her and that he could end up killed like her brother. Anyhow, Aunt May is cured and starting to improve. The end. These issues are solid. I think the Master Planner stuff was a bit undercooked, but I think Ock stealing the ISO and making Peter hate him more for that was solid. just not much resolution here right away. Also, Peter caught under the rubble, I think, led to one of the most iconic comic book covers of all time, a moment pulled straight into the Spider-Man Homecoming films just because it looked cool. Aunt May ended up surviving, but with more health issues emerging, that becomes a very important aspect to Amazing Spider-Man from here. I also think these issues continue the divide between Peter and Betty, which ends up being an important aspect of the series for the next several issues. Amazing Spider-Man 34 sees the return of Kraven, who is plotting revenge against Spider-Man, and his return to New York as Betty dreams Peter is Spider-Man, which pushes her further away from Peter. Peter is also having a hard time. While relieved Aunt May is cured, Gwen and Harry, Peter's new classmates, hate his guts, and he doesn't really know what he did, unaware he was blowing everyone off while he was worrying about Aunt May. From here, we suddenly see Spider-Man attack J. Jonah Jameson, who's very happy to capitalize on this. Peter hears this is going on, but is too worried, wanting to live a normal life for a few days, though eventually he ends up tracking down his double, who ends up being Kraven, back in town. Kraven set a trap for Spider-Man with a mist that will dampen his senses, but Spider-Man manages to fight Kraven regardless, who admits he was the criminal Spider-Man just a few days earlier. Peter can't stop thinking about Betty, but unbeknownst to him, Betty has quit the Daily Bugle. This is an okay issue. I like the Betty stuff primarily, but a lot is crammed into this issue here, which makes Kraven begin to feel very secondary. It becomes more common, as we saw in the last arc around this time, for stories to cover a few issues, which begins to seem more necessary as we see more human drama interjected into the main stories. I also feel Ditko's art is getting a bit lazier around this time. Not bad, just cheaper and quicker for sure. And judging by the fact that his run is nearing its conclusion, it's not hard to surmise why in retrospect. Don't worry, that'll all be covered sooner or later. Not every villain becomes a smash hit, but Ditko and Lee were still flirting with making Molten Man an important rogue. Anyhow, Amazing Spider-Man 35 sees his return. Molten Man is let out of jail with his charges being dropped given the circumstances of his transformation and his seeming regret towards what he did. Molten Man, however, is actually just a dick and doesn't pretend to consider going straight. Bro wanted to hit the streets right away, and hit them he did. Molten Man ends up putting on a shitty disguise and robs a jewelry store, which Spider-Man pulls up on, getting smacked around, which makes Peter figure that it's that pesky Molten Man again. Anyhow, Spider-Man tracks him down and beats him up, bringing him in and taking some pictures for the Bugle. Though when he shows up, he learns Betty is headed off with Ned to the West Coast. This issue's pretty meh, but honestly, I can at least appreciate an action-heavy issue. It's very self-contained and skippable, which is sometimes refreshing in this era when Spider-Man starts getting really dramatic and wordy, which, don't get me wrong, I love, but this is also kind of fun too, just having a more brain-dead Spider-Man issue. Betty leaving also adds an interesting space for other relationships to form. We get more on her soon, but her absence leaves other characters time to edge in, with this period kind of slowly phasing that early main cast into more supporting roles that just pop up here and there or not at all, and new characters starting to fill those roles. Amazing Spider-Man 36 has one of my least favorite covers of the Ditko era. I didn't really mention this much, but Spider-Man has some of the best, most consistent covers in the history of comics, and I think that's just a virtue of the concept of the character, his design, and of course his villains. Even the more abysmal Spider-Man runs can be saved by its covers. This one is boring. The new villain, the Looter, has a bad design, and the white is just too plain. Not a huge complaint, but I love Spider-Man covers, and I'll be pointing out when I think one is particularly shoddy. If I don't mention it, assume I like it. A man, Norton Fester, finds a meteor and becomes the Looter since no one wants to fund his research on the object to his dismay. He gains powers since inside the meteor was a pocket of gas that makes him a supervillain. Nothing too fancy here, a pretty basic origin. The Looter starts a crime spree, which of course captures the attention of Spider-Man, who intends on stopping the villain. After bumping into him at a science fair, the Looter is trying to loot, though is unsuccessful on his first attempt. Gwen Stacy is kind of peeved though at Peter during this time since he doesn't seem to notice her, further angry by the fact that at the science fair battle, while Spider-Man was fighting with the looter, Peter seemingly bitched out and ran away, leaving her there alone. The looter tries another robbery and this time is foiled by Spider-Man, who gives him off to the cops. The looter first appeared in this issue and is one of those villains that didn't really solely belong to Spider-Man, with the character being on an evil iteration of the Defenders, fighting the Ant-Man family, fighting Ben Reilly during his run as Spider-Man, fighting the Fantastic Four, and so on. He's just kind of a C-string villain that makes his way around the Marvel Universe, so to speak. Honestly, this issue's okay. The looter's kind of lame, but the story itself isn't bad. Looter just kind of feels like one of those lame 50s Batman or Superman villains that'd be a one-off, but Grant Morrison or James Gunn digs them up for a project because they're kind of stupid and goofy and they want to do something tragic with them or whatever. Marvel, I think, has less reverence for their weird history, and thus the looter isn't one of the more super well-remembered of Spider-Man's obscure rogues. Issue 37 sees the start of the original culmination of Green Goblin's identity, which starts here and moves to John Romita's early run. This would be expanded in the Osborn Journals one-shot from 1996. A new villain is in town, Professor Strom, who's being followed by Frederick Foswell, when Foswell is sniped at, but Spider-Man saves him. Peter shows up at the Bugle to sort out what's going on, and Foswell explains what's up with Strom. Gwen is mad at Peter and making her feelings known as Flash shows up and starts pressing Peter, who stands his ground. Though in the meantime, Strom has created a robot he sends to Oscorp, which is run by Norman, the father of Peter's friend Harry. Spider-Man finds said robot, destroying the lab, and destroys the robot, though a second laser-armored one is deployed. Spider-Man follows the robot to Norman's office, and Norman is fuming with the robot destroying everything. Spider-Man is knocked unconscious, then again tracks the robot to Strom's lab, who tries to surrender but is sniped dead by a mysterious sniper. Spider-Man pursues but finds no trace of the gunman, as we see Norman conveniently polishing one of his rifles. Norman Osborn is finally named in this book and is implied to be the killer of Strom, but why he's killed is not revealed yet. It is sort of confusing, but Stan Lee basically wanted Norman to be Green Goblin, while Steve Ditko wasn't convinced he should truly be Green Goblin, setting him up as more of a red herring if Stan Lee's version of events is to be believed. Regardless, this is the first appearance of Norman proper rather than just Green Goblin, who was more or less retconned, or at least revealed to be one and the same. Mendel Strom is the robot master who seemingly dies here but is later retconned, having had survived, eventually becoming a full-on cyborg man, eventually dying for real down the line in Amazing Spider-Man Volume 5, Issue 5 from 2018. This is a decent issue that sets up the coming of Norman Osborn and moves Green Goblin from a cool-looking character to a downright sinister villain that he is today. And I think this is the start of Green Goblin kind of becoming a cultural figure associated with Spider-Man, the way Joker is Batman. I think this is sort of the elevation of the Green Goblin character, and the mystery this issue sets up is definitely more interesting than the sum of its parts to this point, so to speak. Though I do think Strom's robots are well enough designed. Amazing Spider-Man 38 is Steve Ditko's final issue of Amazing Spider-Man before the co-creator would leave the company. Much of this revolves around Norman Osborn and his creation, supposedly, as you can see here in issue 23, a background character looks like Norman, and later in issue 26 and 27. Steve basically said it was his idea that Norman and the Goblin were one and the same, where Stan said it was his and Romita's idea, and that Steve wanted it to be a fake-out. The previous story also kind of implies Norman is shady and not Green Goblin per se, and Steve loved his crime characters, think Big Man and Crime Master. Regardless if Norman's identity was made up by Lee or Ditko, the two men started not getting along so well. Steve more quaint and quiet, while Stan was more loud and dramatic, so Steve left the book. He would keep working up to his death in 2018, primarily in indie comics near the end of his life, though after Marvel, leaving for Charlton, where he created some other characters, including The Question and the Ted Kord version of Blue Beetle, before DC bought Charlton, but he also worked at DC proper, notably creating the Creeper and Hawk and Dove. I remember like 10 or 15 years ago, you could still buy his new books and stuff off his website as they'd occasionally trickle out, with Steve giving very few interviews despite making one of the most major characters in all of American media, with him staying out of Spider-Man's business for the rest of his life. Anyhow, back to Spider-Man 38. You may notice the cover of this book looks a little ramshackle together. That's because Steve Ditko never actually made a cover for this one. Rather, the cover was assembled from portions of the interior art of the book. The comic stars a guy named Joe, or Joseph Smith. That is just his name. Anyhow, he becomes a stuntman and is being put through it a bit. Anyhow, Peter and Ned are wondering where Betty has gone since she left recently. Joe starts going on a rampage, and Spider-Man trying to stop this rampage as Norman is offering people a $20,000 bounty for Spider-Man's head. Villains start running around attacking Spider-Man trying to collect the bounty when Spider-Man runs into Joe again. Spider-Man wishes he didn't have to hide his identity and is sad about Betty also missing another chance to meet with the mysterious Mary Jane. Joe Smith first appeared here, nothing too notable about the man, but that is sort of the point of the character. I mean, Joe Smith is just your everyman, hence the name, Joe Smith. This issue is solid, but it definitely has the attitude that Steve was kind of on his way out. Spider-Man is pissed and sad. Joe is very much a lazy villain, basically by design. The Norman Osborn mystery also continues a bit here. I think it's all sort of summarized by Spider-Man punching a dummy, pretending it's Ned, but having Stan Lee's likeness. Following Ditko's departure from the book, John Romita Sr., an artist who worked in the industry since the early 50s, would pick up his place, with Stan Lee staying on as writer for the book during this part of the series, taking over on issue 39 and going to issue 75 before a hiatus, returning for issues 82 through 88, and then a few other singles here and there, and doing covers for almost the entire series up to this point. Doing occasional covers for the series here and there, pretty much up till his death. John Romita Jr., his son, would also take up the Amazing Spider-Man series a few times, even recently. Romita's style is dynamic and clean, being a bit more superhero-esque than Steve Ditko's, with characters having soft features that almost feels manga-like, at least manga of the day. This is all perhaps fitting of the college years of Peter Parker, and while Stan Lee and Steve Ditko created Spider-Man and many of his villains, this era solidified many of Spider-Man's traits and set it in stone basically. The format of the series moving forward changes a bit, and arguably this run is equally important to Steve's in its own unique way. Anyhow, let's jump right into it. Amazing Spider-Man 39 and 40 are halves of a two-part arc revealing the Green Goblin's mystery, set up in the past several issues, along with being the inaugural issues of John Romita Sr.'s run on the Amazing Spider-Man. Green Goblin is planning a revenge ploy on Spider-Man as Peter learns from Dr. Bromwell that any excitement or shock could cause poor old Aunt May's heart to stop. Later we see Harry Osborn's concerned about his dad, as we see his dad is clearly irate for some reason, with Peter having a brief moment with Harry that starts blossoming their friendship a bit. Soon as Spider-Man, Peter runs into some gang members who hit him with goblin gas that dampens his senses long enough for him to not notice that the Green Goblin was tailing him and sees him change back to Peter. Green Goblin ambushes Peter and pulls him off, leading to a cliffhanger of him being captured by Green Goblin. While tied up, since Green Goblin figures Spider-Man is finished, he reveals himself to be Harry's dad Norman, and the issue cuts off. Issue 40 sees Peter trying to stall Green Goblin, who gladly explains how Peter basically got lucky in the past to escape his fate repeatedly, talking about his previous defeats since his initial appearance. Also explaining how he became Green Goblin following an accident at Oscorp from Strom, who he reveals he shot a few issues prior. This led Norman to pivot from a businessman to a supervillain. Goblin frees Peter to fight him fair and square to finally prove he's superior, and while he's a strong foe, Peter eventually manages to subdue him, making Norman lose his memories of ever having been Green Goblin. Feeling some sympathy, but also since Harry wouldn't be able to handle the truth, Peter saves Norman and pretends that the man was never the Green Goblin. While this is happening, Betty also returns to New York, which is important, but not quite yet, so I'll just put a tag in this right here. This duology boasts some of the most iconic covers. Issue 39, for example, is probably one of my favorite Spider-Man covers of all time, and proves Romita wasn't going to come in and half-ass it, knowing full well, I suspect, that taking over this title could eventually become a career-defining moment for him, and also hoping to cement Spider-Man, I think, as a character that would live past half its original creative team leaving. I also like the comic filling in the Norman Osborn as Green Goblin gaps, making what was essentially a retcon more lively. I also think the prospect of the two-parter, while rare in this time period, was smart. It adds so much and cements this as the first Green Goblin story I find to be a true classic beyond its historical context alone. Peter befriending Harry is a smart seed that sows conflict later on, but also gives Peter his first genuine platonic friendship in the whole series, since largely his cast has been passive acquaintances, bullies, and love interests, with of course Aunt May being there too. I think this is especially important as Peter enters the Mary Jane-Gwen love triangle, and as Aunt May starts taking a back seat in the story compared to the early years, as we'll soon cover. Overall, it's another classic, and I think John Romita and Stan Lee came out swinging on the first major rehaul of The Amazing Spider-Man's very long run. Following a great first showing came Romita's first major co-creation with issue 41 introducing the Rhino. Peter Parker gets J. Jonah Jameson to front him money for a motorcycle. Then when he leaves, J. Jonah Jameson's son John shows up and the two begin discussing Spider-Man, with John believing that Spider-Man isn't the asshole his father claims he is, recalling Amazing Spider-Man issue 1 when Spider-Man saved him from a crashing space shuttle. Anyhow, space spores attached to John on his last spacewalk. As towards the American-Mexico border, the Rhino makes his first appearance, charging through Border Patrol agents. Peter meets with Betty, but the two find out the love they once shared was dead in the water after months of anticipating seeing each other and kind of having this conversation they needed to have. This is as the Rhino makes it to New York. I guess the man can really run quite fast. Anyhow, the Rhino captures John Jameson, hoping to sell him off to the highest bidder so that they can use his space spores, I guess, for space research. I don't know, it's the 60s, everybody loves space. Spider-Man fights the Rhino, who's eventually subdued, and John is saved. Peter bumps into Gwen on his new motorcycle, and the two realize they have some mutual feelings for each other, as who wouldn't be into a guy on a bike. Though as he makes it home, May reminds him that he'll be finally meeting MJ, setting up our new love triangle, literally the same issue they put a fork in Betty's arc. Rhino, or Alexei Skavakovich, first appears here. He is exactly as he sounds, a Russian man in a giant rhino costume. Over time, I think they tried to make Rhino look a little less, odd. He's an occasional hero, but is mostly just a villain, and for a Spider-Man character, isn't the most odd duck, with most of them having wild stories in their history, but Rhino's simply just an angry Russian man through and through, though Paul Giamatti also played him for 3 seconds in Amazing Spider-Man 2, which I will find endlessly funny for the rest of my life. I like this issue. The Rhino is fine, but what I think is most interesting is the human factor. For one, Peter and Betty's love affair comes to an end, and I think it was a pretty realistic portrayal of a fading romance. Also leaving her open to play more of a background role as we see Gwen jump into her place, along with Mary Jane, which would eventually be a more solid love triangle than the love triangle between Betty and Liz that Steve Ditko and Stan Lee briefly flirted with exploring earlier in this run. It's an all-around solid issue, but Rhino comes more into play as time goes on with things like his multiple appearances in the Sinister Six. I always found him to be a better supporting role, personally anyhow. Amazing Spider-Man Annual 3 sees a few backup stories pulling from past issues, 11 and 12 to be specific, but the new feature sees Spider-Man's first true crossover with the Avengers, who he only had brief encounters with previously. As is common for specials or annuals of the day, this book is largely removed from the wider arc of the comic series and is mostly standalone. The Avengers are considering adding Spider-Man to their ranks as an Avenger, offering to test him, saying that if he can bring the Hulk in, they'll add him to the team, which Spider-Man accepts. Spider-Man tracks the Hulk, who after punching a gamma device is turned back into Bruce Banner. Spider-Man thinks the Avengers are kind of fucked up for trying to get him to bring a sick man like Banner in, so he decides not to capture the Hulk, and in that moment decides he was just going to continue to roll solo from now on. This comic is fun. It's cool to see Spider-Man brush up with Earth's mightiest heroes, and it has some classic Spider-Man hijinks that leads him to think the Avengers are messed up, and at one point, wanting to fight him even. We also get Daredevil showing up to sing Spider-Man's praises, and by the end, Spider-Man makes his decision to run solo, a move that, despite what things like the MCU may show, largely was Spider-Man's status quo for most of his history until more modern comics, when he would be an occasional Avenger and hop on other teams and stuff. I also think he just works best as a solo character. I like this issue. It's goofy, it's not serious, but it's a pretty fun annual. Issue 42 is an interesting issue in that it sees the temporary corruption of John Jameson, who in the last issue was singing Spider-Man's praises. In a classic setup, we see someone who appears to be Spider-Man robbing a bank. Meanwhile, we see that John's spores are expanding and making him a little bit crazy, with J. Jonah Jameson's son thinking he could be a superhero, and with Spider-Man seemingly robbing a bank, he wants to stop Spider-Man to finally vindicate his father, and making up for the fact that he defended a crook like Spider-Man for so long. While this happens, Peter meets up with Gwen, who invites him to a party, though he declines since he promised to finally meet Mary Jane by request of Aunt May. Soon Spider-Man meets John and the two fight, with Spider-Man explaining the misunderstanding about the bank, stating one of the money bags had a bomb in it and he was disposing of it, not trying to steal but to save the bank and all the lives in it. Spider-Man makes it away and proves to Jameson he was uninvolved with the bank crimes. J. Jonah Jameson is mad about it but concedes, though this is when John shows up for a rematch. Spider-Man again makes it off, but the pair end up fighting in an empty warehouse, with John clearly having gone mad by the space spores. Spider-Man manages to stop the spores and save John. Later, Peter meets Mary Jane and learns that she's actually hot. This book sees Mary Jane finally have her first full appearance, finally paying off her and Peter's prolonged meeting. Mary Jane is kind of a weird character, introduced as kind of the new Liz, so to speak, being the weaker side of the love triangle. Following Gwen's death, though, Peter and Mary Jane get together. The pair date for a good while and then get married, which seems to be the status quo for a good amount of time. Peter and her had a stillborn baby at one point after she was poisoned. Eventually, the two's marriage was retconned in One More Day, perhaps one of the most controversial comic lines of all time. I talked about it briefly in my Civil War retrospective, but she just kind of limbers around for a long time with not much to do, then briefly joined the Iron Man comic line in basically the place of Pepper Potts, but eventually got back with Peter, something fans wanted, so naturally they ended up ending that again, and they sent her to the multiverse. After a while though, she's brought out and becomes the third iteration of the superhero jackpot, which she is to this day currently. She's a whole thing. Anyhow, we'll get more in depth into all of this, and most likely much more by the time we get to all this down the line. I kind of liked this book. It's decent. John Jameson is going from a Spider-Man defender to being deranged and trying to kill him. It's kind of a fun setup. Of course, John goes through a few changes, but this dabbling in villainy is pretty fun, even if the suit felt like it was something out of the 50s Legion of Superhero comics or something. Mary Jane finally joining the cast was cool, and the "Face It Tiger, You Hit the Jackpot" panel is absolutely iconic to Spider-Man. This book is almost worth reading for that panel alone. The bank robbery plot was a bit weird and convoluted, but I don't know, whatever. It's a comic book setup from the 60s, what do I expect? Amazing Spider-Man 43 sees the return of the Rhino, taking place right after issue 41 and 42, which all take place in fairly quick succession, though aren't considered a full arc. There's kind of loose elements that intermingle between them. The Rhino escapes jail as no prison cell can hold him or whatever, while we learn that Betty and Ned officially decided to get engaged following Peter and Betty learning their feelings had dissolved. Peter is not in attendance, though is at home in awe of Mary Jane, who he finally met after all this time. This is when we learn the Rhino escaped, and Mary Jane, who's eager for adventure, wants to check it out. Peter becomes Spider-Man and confronts the Rhino, who gets the best of him. Spider-Man goes to Kirk Connors, hoping to get the modified lizard antidote to fight the Rhino, as the villain continues his mission from issue 41, still wanting to capture John Jameson for money. Anyhow, Spider-Man hits the Rhino with the antidote, defeating the villain. He heads home, though we learn some new revelations. For one, Aunt May is gravely ill, not filling her prescriptions since the thing costed too much, and so the classic American health system struck again. On top of that, we learn Flash was drafted to Vietnam, a call he was eager to answer. This is a fucking Spider-Man issue, man. Betty and Ned get engaged, Aunt May's deathly ill, Flash is going to Vietnam, and Peter's attracted to Mary Jane, which surely will throw some confusion towards his growing feelings for Gwen. We also see Rhino, who gets the best of Spider-Man, before a somewhat cunning defeat of the villain. Also kind of wrapping up the plot arcs from the last 3 issues. Alright, I'm going to cut it off here for now though, but while this part saw less major creations than the issues we covered in the previous part, it had a full flipping of the status quo, showing Peter's early college days, introducing Gwen, Harry, and MJ in place of Flash, Betty, and Liz, and replacing Steve Ditko with John Romita. I also think, with so many changes to the status quo in the works with the book, the artist switch feels a little less abrupt. I also felt around the time that Peter graduated, you could start to really feel Steve's disillusion with Marvel starting to seep into the book a bit, and I think his best work was defining Peter's early high school years. Not that that's a bad thing, since that is the character's most iconic era, but his leaving wasn't a total momentum killer, especially since, as I hope I portrayed, John Romita came in with a hunger to take the book into a new era that would last the test of time, much as the first part did. Anyhow, more about Romita and Lee's run when we return in part 3.